So welcome back, listeners, to Snippit Sports Science, proudly brought to you by eliteform.com. And today we've got a special guest, Dr Christopher Brandner, strength and conditioning coach who's an Australian, living at Aspire, working at Aspire Academy. Welcome aboard, Christopher.
G'day, Chris. Thanks for having me along.
Or do you prefer Chris?
Look, my mother calls me Christopher, but you can call me Chris. That's fine.
I'll call you Chris. I'm the same as well. I don't like being called Christopher, to be honest, but
only when we're told off, Chris.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So thanks for coming on board. Happy New Year to you.
Yeah, thanks, mate. Same to you.
Chris did his PhD in the area of blood flow restriction, and it's obviously an area of great interest to myself. And so I'm really honoured to have him on board. He's one of the first authors, and this was part of, as I said, his PhD that he did, and really intrigued to get into this and possibly also may get some more of his papers as we go along. So just as a little bit of a background first about you, Chris, just tell us a bit about your journey as an academic going through your PhD onto your role now at Aspire Academy.
Okay, no problems. I think I'll start with what I'm doing now and work our way back, because I think our conversation will be mainly talking about BFR. So at the minute, as you said, I'm currently working at Aspire Academy, which is a sports academy, an elite sports academy in Doha, Qatar. I've been there for 4 years now, and I was originally employed as a talent ID officer. So we span the country, and it's only a small country, but we basically went to every single primary school in the country, looking at the physical fitness of primary school age boys, age 11 to 12, and bringing the best boys into the academy for training for a variety of sports. And in the last 6 months, that role has sort of changed, and I'm a full-time S&C now, working with our fencing and our athletic development groups. Been doing that for the last 2.5 years or so, but that's now a formal job title. And before that, my journey to get into Aspire, I started studying at Deakin University in 2010. I did an honours study looking at exercise training in the heat and recovery from that exercise training, and that kind of fits well into life in Qatar as well, because day-to-day temperatures are 50 degrees, so it does get hot over there. But then after that, I was offered an opportunity to do a scholarship, a PhD scholarship at Deakin University, and had to come up with a research topic. And I could have continued that line of research, but I knew I was interested in S&C and wanted to do something with training and maybe athletes. Everyone wants to work with athletes. But one of my supervisors at the time was an ex-S&C coach, and said, look, there's this thing called a vascular occlusion training, as it was known about 10 years ago. That's what we were calling it. He said, read this paper and what do you think? And, I had this PhD scholarship dangling in front of me. I'm like, yep, grabbed it with two hands and wasn't quite sure that's exactly what I wanted to do, but it's turned out to be great. And I think as any PhD student, you definitely get very much involved in your research and you end up loving what you're doing. So my PhD, when I finished that in 2015. So it was mainly full-time and a little bit part-time after I got the job in Qatar. And the finished title was the neuromuscular and cardiovascular responses to resistance training with BFR. So did some acute studies, did some training studies, and it was really good. It's been great for my career so far, and it's a good topic of conversation.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's very pertinent, and probably at the end there we'll get into, I guess, the evolution of BFR. According to the snippet type structure of our podcast, we are really keen to go through a specific paper. And the one that we've got in front of us right now is called Muscular Adaptations to Whole Body Blood Flow Restriction Training and Detraining. Is this the first paper in your PhD?
That's not. This is my final study, actually. It's a training study. My first two studies that have been published were acute exercise studies, so resistance training, single arm, so unilateral biceps curl. The first study that was published looked at the cardiovascular responses. And I think at the time when I started, there weren't too many papers that compared blood flow restriction, which is, with light loads, 20% of 1 rep max. A lot of papers were just comparing with the same load without BFR. And really, in S&C, everyone's lift heavy weights, and we need to lift heavy weights to get bigger and stronger. So why aren't we comparing it? So I think a big theme of my PhD was actually comparing all three training protocols together, and that sort of evolved across time. So the first one looked at cardiovascular responses, just a bicep curl training. Very generally, we've found, all exercise training increases cardiovascular demand, and it's not any difference with single arm training either. The heavy load condition increased heart rate and blood pressure to greater degrees than lifting light loads. And then the blood flow restriction group was somewhere in between those two. So it was not dissimilar to lifting heavy, but it wasn't dissimilar to lifting light either. And I think for healthy population, that's important. But then as the BFR research has started to do more lately now is looking at clinical populations and elderly populations as well. And that's where our line of thinking was at that time. So that was the first paper. And the second one looked at neuromuscular responses. So we used a technique called transcranial magnetic stimulation and did a whole bunch of brain zapping before and after exercise with heavy loads, light loads, and BFR. And basically what we found was acute increases in cortical responses, so increase in excitability, no changes in inhibition. But basically that response was increased to a greater degree with the blood flow restriction conditions versus lifting heavy loads and lifting light loads. So something is happening perhaps, at the muscle site, feedback to the brain to say, hey, we need to increase motor output to the muscle to overcome this. Well, it's not a force, but it's a fatigue. And that was maintained for up to 60 minutes post-exercise as well. So they were two acute studies, and those two studies then led into this training study as well.
Some really nice background there. Let's get into the study. As you said, probably has really good application to a lot of S&C coaches out there that need to actually start looking this data beside real-world lifting, where we need to be lifting loads at 65, 70% of 1RM. I think as, myself and a lot of other people say, at the end of the day, we need to be lifting heavy load. Well, we need to be prescribing heavy loads to our athletes. There's no substitute for that. But once again, there are many advantages of using low load or moderate load BFR for athletes who might be compromised. However, saying that, a little bit of background there, you gave some background there. Anything else that, really stands out that for the listener that's important to outline in your introduction?
This is unpublished, this article. Actually, we've just submitted it to a BFR special in the Journal of Frontiers. So hopefully that goes through review successfully and gets up. I collected this data in 2014. And, you've just finished your PhD as well. And I'm not sure if you published along the way, but this data has now been sitting there on my computer for the last 4 or 5 years and doing nothing. So it's good to finally submit it and get it out there. From those two acute studies, it evolved into a training study. Not many studies were doing long-term training, so 2, 4, 6 weeks. So this was an 8-week training study. When I first started, there were no studies looking at the detraining effects either. So I thought, great, let's just tack that onto the end of it. So all in all, it was an 8-week training study plus 4 weeks detraining. And we looked at muscular adaptations in healthy young university population. Out of this paper, we looked at changes in strength and changes in mass. And then there'll be another paper that comes through as well, which goes on from those two acute studies that look at the training adaptations of the cardiovascular system and also the neuromuscular system with the CMS brain zapping stuff. So this is just one aspect of that final training study that we're trying to get out there at the minute. So as I said, it's an 8-week training study where we got participants to come in and then they were randomized. We had 39 participants involved, 27 males, 12 females, and then they were randomized into one of 4 training conditions. So one of those conditions was a control group that did nothing, a heavy load training group trained at 70% of their 1RM, a light load training group which trained at 20% of their 1RM, and then a BFR group which trained at 20% of 1RM with blood flow restriction, and maybe we can talk about those specifics a little bit later. But basically we measured baseline strength and baseline body composition using dual X-ray absorptiometry or DEXA for short, and muscle thickness with ultrasound. And it was a huge data collection period. We measured it at baseline at 4 weeks, which is the midpoint of training, 8 weeks, the end of training, and then after 4 weeks of detraining, so 12 weeks. So I was talking to my supervisor recently. It's a 12-week training study, but really to get almost 40 participants through a 12-week training study, you don't do that all at once. And this is like a 12-month, I can't remember exactly, at least 12-month data collection study. So it was pretty full on. One of the main things we looked at was a lot of the studies that were coming out were single exercise or small muscle mass, unilateral biceps or knee extension, or, maybe it was bench press only studies. And we're like, well, that doesn't really replicate real world training. So this was a full body training program with or without BFR. So 3 upper body exercises and 3 lower body exercises. Obviously the BFR wasn't applied to all of that musculature at the same time. And so 6 resistance exercises, and we measured 7 different muscle sites, the adaptations that occurred.
Yeah, I think when I read it, the first thing that really stands out for me is that it's a really good session. You got knee extension, back squat, calf raise, barbell, bench press, seated row, and bicep curls. It's real world. And I think firstly, exactly as you said, I read papers, I get excited by it, and I go, oh, it was a knee extension or it was a bicep curl. And I just go, I can take the findings from that. But this here is something we'd prescribe for our athletes, wouldn't it?
I think so, and I hope so. I mean, as I said, it was a university population, so I'll fully disclose that. I was doing a PhD in the university, so it's an easy population to recruit. Loved having those posters up there. Do you want to increase your strength and muscle size? And it's tough to get 40 participants in a training study. So I'll disclose that early on. But it was that, and as well as the detraining effects, I think were the two big aspects of this study that we're pretty proud of.
Yeah, fantastic. And so just in terms of the BFR, a lot of people talk about cuff size and pressures. Just want to talk briefly about that. And then from that point there, let's just get straight into the results.
When I first started my PhD, the question was, how are we going to do BFR? We had no idea. There wasn't too many products available commercially or anything like that. We needed to use it with mass amount of population. It wasn't just my study going on that, we've ended up having honours students and other PhD students using it as well. So what I found was this surgical equipment. So a Zimmer automatic tourniquet system 3000, so there's a version 4000 now, but basically it was used to cut off blood flow during surgical procedures. And got onto that. We've got some upper body cuffs and some lower body cuffs. The cuff widths and lengths are all in the paper, but they were wider than what you might normally see, especially from like the Japanese group. I think the lower body cuffs were 10 centimeters and the upper body cuffs were, I think, 8 centimeters. So they were fairly wide, but because we've got wide cuffs, that kind of means that we can use lower restriction pressures as well. And through the evolution of my PhD, when I first started in 2011, there weren't that many studies out there, and certainly not in English. The first English paper was published in 1998, and Jeremy Leniecki, who most people, if they know BFR, have heard of Jeremy Leniecki. He's the most prolific BFR researcher out there, and he probably only had a couple papers out at that time point. So nobody really knew what they were doing, arbitrary pressures and everything like that. But this Zimmer tourniquet system basically allowed us to measure the maximal arterial occlusion in the upper body and lower body just by a finger or a toe sensor. So what we did, we would sit participants down in an upright position, we would measure their maximal occlusion pressures, and then we would take a percentage of that as their final restriction pressure. And we used a percentage of 60%. And that seems to be in line with the literature. Some studies have shown 40% is just as effective as 90% restriction pressure. So 60% should be safe enough and effective enough to increase, this muscle strength and muscle size.
And then from that point there, we've got our 4 different groups, 3 different training groups. What were the main findings from this?
It's kind of difficult to discuss them because we had these 3 lower body exercises. We had these 3 upper body exercises that we did 1RM testing with. We had these 7 different muscle sites where we measured muscle thickness. And then we had our body composition stuff with the DEXA. And it was hard to write up the discussion because some things went up, some things didn't change, some things might have come down. The things that went up, maybe they were similar between groups. Other times, one group may have had an advantage over another group. So it was a difficult write-up. Yeah, it's a funny one. I've got a figure in front of me. Basically, if we talk about the strength changes first, I guess, the main outcome for me was the knee extension exercise. That was the first exercise we did in the training study. It seemed to align a lot with the previous BFR literature as well. And we also used the knee extension to measure the acute responses for the cardiovascular stuff and the neuromuscular stuff for those other training studies that we're doing. So for me, the knee extension was the main outcome exercise. And what we found was that at 4 weeks and at the final training point, 8 weeks, the blood flow restriction group and the heavy group increased by, I think, 20 and 24% respectively. So both groups increased similarly. The light load group also increased muscle strength in the knee extension, and all groups increased greater than the control group. Why were there no real differences between the groups? I'm not sure. Maybe it was because we did include more than one exercise. So, the next exercise we did was the squat. And if squat 1RM increased as well as your knee extension increased, then maybe there's an overall effect on muscle strength. And that's why there was no differences between groups. So for me, it was kind of difficult to discuss those individual changes. I will say, though, that for the upper body, it seemed like the heavy load group had a much greater advantage in terms of increasing muscle strength. So for the bench press, the BFR group increased bench press, but it was not significant, whereas the heavy load group did, and all groups generally increased greater than the control group. And the other thing that I think I'd like to point out was that we did the seated row. There are studies that show that the muscle groups that aren't occluded increase muscle mass or increase muscle size, but it's mainly been shown with the bench press. I think we're the first study to show that, horizontal pulling exercises can also be improved with BFR training. So I thought that was one cool aspect. But again, the heavy load group trumped all the other groups. So really, when we summed all of the 6 exercises together in terms of the strength change, so we're looking at total tonnage, all groups increased total tonnage, but the heavy load group was greater than the BFR group and the light load group. So training heavy was better in terms of increasing muscle strength. I think the total tonnage increase was something like 21%, whereas the change for the BFR group was 11% and the change for the light load group was 12%. So heavy is better than BFR, but BFR is equal to lifting light loads, and all groups were greater than the control group, which didn't change strength. If you're going to want to improve muscle strength, as you said at the start of the podcast, lifting heavy is still what you need to do.
Perfect. In terms of changes in body comp, muscle thickness, any major take-homes there for you?
Not really, and we almost not excluded it from the paper, but we almost excluded the write-up in the discussion section because everything was so variable and there were no real differences between the groups across the training program, even from the control group. So that's pretty annoying. But what we did find when the groups were, so there was no group by time effect, but there was a time effect across the training program. So lean mass increased, but that was the same across all groups. And, it kind of means that the control group also increased lean mass, if you look at it like that. Fat mass didn't change except for after detraining. And I actually attribute that to people going away on Christmas break and coming back after the new year. Arm and leg lean mass increased, but, no differences between groups. And for ultrasound, I think you'll find that the only 2 group by time differences were for quadriceps and biceps. And what you'll find there is the heavy load group increased quadriceps muscle thickness greater than all other groups. That was the only difference for absolute and also for the normalized stuff. Basically, when we look at the BFR stuff, I think one of the big conclusions everyone is coming to is that if you want to get stronger, okay, you can increase strength with BFR, and there are populations that could do BFR training to get stronger. But if you're healthy, okay, you get stronger, but you're always going to get stronger lifting at higher percentages of your 1RM. But changes in muscle mass can be similar. So I think that's the big take-home. Strength, you need to lift heavy loads, but muscle mass changes, you can lift light loads, you can lift heavy loads, or you can lift light loads with BFR. I think that's my big take-home. Yeah,
I totally agree on that one. And also, I guess, being a recreational athlete or recreational group, is there any conclusions that you can take out of that as well?
In terms of training or training with BFR or
just training in general, because normally when you have people that are recreational trained, you could give them most type of training sessions, and say if you've had no training background at all, and you say, right, at the end of the day, if you want the maximum response, you got to lift some heavy stuff here. However, athletes who are technically quite poor will get quite sore, might struggle with that type of training. So being able to look at different tools such as using BFR could potentially overcome those limitations of load and also technical limitations. So you can actually take time to teach them how to squat properly, how to bench press properly and so forth, and therefore get those increments in gains without putting them at risk due to poor technique, for example.
Yep, I agree. And, regarding technique change, we didn't have the time. It's already a 12-week training study. It would be nice now looking back to have done a familiarization training week or weeks on end, because I think, they probably weren't all equal through all exercises at baseline. The squat group with the light load group was so much lower than all the other groups. It's when you look at the figure, their squat 1RM increased way more than everyone else. So that novelty of just squatting and learning how to squat with light loads, allowed them to increase their 1RM. So their 1RM wasn't a true 1RM at the start of training probably. So the learning effect with some of the groups, I think, could have been diminished if we had a familiarization session or training weeks at the start of the study.
And that's also one of the things in hindsight, we'd always do things totally differently.
Yeah, I'll go back to your question as well. One of the conclusions I sort of come up to is with this healthy population, like everyone got better, everyone increased mass, everyone increased strength, and we looked at this whole body aspect of BFR. Maybe that's also not the best way to go about it. Maybe you don't just train for 8 weeks blood flow restriction, and at 20% of your 1RM. Maybe there's other ways. I was kind of thinking maybe the BFR group or the light load group probably could have done even better if we did, a 2-week training block at 20%, increased to 30% for another 2 weeks, and then increased again to 40%, because some of those individuals didn't increase strength at 4 weeks, so their percentage of 1RM couldn't change for the second training block. That could happen, or there's some training studies that lift heavy. So in your athletic environment, they lift heavy, but, maybe 1 or 2 exercises, and then you might finish with blood flow restriction.
And that's where I think some of this training really fits quite nicely in with athletic populations where you recognize that you need to lift a heavy load, but you can actually decrease that mechanical stress. So instead of going, 85, 90, 95, 100%, you can bring it down to say 70, 75%, supplement that decrement in mechanical stress with an increase in metabolic stress through BFR, and especially in that in-season type format where you got one lift, you got players in a contact-based sport who are quite sore, can then use that to decrease the load on the body, attenuates that joint pain and tendon pain. I know a lot of football players really struggle with knee joints and tendinopathies, and they just go, it just feels so good. So I think that's where you can then bring the two worlds a little bit closer together and actually look at that high load, moderate to high load lifting with BFR.
Yeah, for sure. And, talking in that contact sport realm, maybe after a match, players aren't ready to lift heavy. So maybe your first lifting session of the week is light loads with BFR. And then when they're right to go a few days before a game and 5 days post match, maybe they're ready to lift their heavy session then. So within a training week, you're getting a heavy stimulus in one session, and you're getting your BFR stimulus, your lighter loads, higher volume work in another session. So could be another way to do it.
Yeah, definitely. Just back to the paper, any concluding thoughts in relation to it? Overall,
what we found was that whole body resistance training with blood flow restriction did improve muscle strength and muscle size. So that's a plus, and that's what is now known in the literature. People have been showing that for a few years now. And the general trend, I think, is that if you want to get strong, you should lift heavy loads. And what we found was that our heavy load group improved their overall strength, their total tonnage strength by 21%. BFR group increased by 11%, and the light load group increased by 12%. You want to get strong, lift heavy loads, and it's more similar to BFR and light load lifting. So they'll be the same. But in terms of muscle mass, perhaps all three types of training will improve muscle mass. And maybe that's because the training volume was high in this study, 6 exercises, multiple muscle groups that we hit through the training week, 3 times a week. For me, overall, if you want to get strong, lift heavy. And if muscle mass gain is your thing, then lifting heavy or supplementing that with some BFR or even some light loads is going to be your thing as well. And as well, if you're going to stop training for 4 weeks, we've got athletes that disappear for a number of weeks and then return. And, we always worry about how much strength loss or muscle mass loss. What we did find is that the heavy load group was still 14% stronger after 4 weeks of detraining. The BFR group was 6% stronger, but only the heavy load group was significantly stronger than all the other groups as well. So again, that strength maintenance for me, you still need to be lifting heavy weights during training to maintain strength after periods of detraining as well. That's probably the big take homes for me.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for reviewing the paper. Really appreciate that. And obviously, always an honour to get the first author coming onto the podcast.
No problems, Chris. Yeah, thanks for that. So hopefully this gets up in a BFR special in Frontiers. It's not published yet, so fingers crossed it gets through.
Definitely. And obviously, if it does get published, we'll know about it all through social media, which is a nice segue into your own social media following. How do people get a hold of you and see what you're up to?
I think the best way for me is Twitter. I mean, I used to be pretty active on Twitter. Now I just sort of retweet a whole bunch of stuff, and that's at Chris.Brandner. So that's Brandner. And it's the same for my Instagram, which is a mix of social stuff and training stuff. And my Facebook is more of a personal thing. So yeah, Twitter's number one, and my email is linked to there as well. So I'm pretty responsive via email, and anyone can shoot me any questions or queries at any time.
Thank you very much. And thanks for coming on board.
Thanks, Chris.
Okay, and thanks to all you listeners out there. Remember to leave us a rating on iTunes. Also visit us on our own socials at Snippit Science and also on the other forms through our website at snippetscience.com. Thanks for listening.